I'm actually super excited for these wide receiver rankings because we have some changes. We have some players that are back. Now, starting tier one, I'm not even going to talk about them. You know to start them if they are good to go. Now, going to tier two, if Cooper Kupp is playing this week, Cooper Kupp better be in your lineup. Initial reports are saying that Kupp will be at practice. Initial reports saying that Puka Nacua not going to practice at all. It sounds like Puka's weeks away from coming back, whereas Cooper Kupp may be here right now. You go back to week one before the Cooper Kupp injury, the man had 21 targets and 110 receiving yards. The matchup against the Raiders, you'd imagine that this is a spot where the Rams are able to just run the ball in the second half, but hell, I don't care. If Kupp's good to go, you start him. Now, going over to our next wide receiver, we are going to be looking at Stephon Diggs. Stupid brief here, but we know with no Nico Collins, Diggs is a top 10 option. I mean, Diggs, 19 points this past week, 14 the week prior, 18 the week before that, 19 the week before that, has been a consistent top option. It's a matchup against the Packers in which you probably see the Texans forced to throw the ball a considerable amount, knowing how strong this Packers offense is. So start Diggs. And Terry McLaurin, wide receiver 10. This will be the highest I have ever ranked Terry McLaurin to my knowledge. I've been doing these rankings every single week for years and years and years. And now I could say this week, Terry McLaurin is a top 10 number where you're looking at the best season that you've had all year with 23 fantasy points. While yes, this does come off of 2 touchdowns with only 7 targets, the number one reason that McLaurin is going to be this high is given the matchup you have against the Carolina Panthers. If you look at Las Vegas sportsbooks, this week they are marking the Washington Commanders to be the highest scoring offense in the NFL. Now, of course, that means that you should be extremely excited about Jaden Daniels, extremely excited about the running backs, but also it makes Terry McLaurin an easy projection to be a wide receiver 1 in fantasy. Deebo Samuel will be your next guy. Looking at Deebo, the matchup against KC is pretty tough. I mean, for the games he's played this year, you've had at least 10 fantasy points. We've seen the ceiling as well with no Christian McCaffrey. You've had some of these artificial touches with Deebo Samuel where you are continuing to see him actually rush the ball. Now with Jordan Mason potentially banged up as well, you can have even more artificial touches for Deebo Samuel. But like I said, it's a tough matchup against the Chiefs where you actually only have an implied team total of 24.5 points for this Niners offense, which is much lower than usual. Mike Evans will be your next name. Obviously, Evans was a lot lower in the rankings last week than this, but that was because Mike Evans went up against Marshawn Lattimore. Here going up against the Baltimore Ravens, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, I mean, are dogs by about 3.5 points in this matchup. So you should see Tampa forced to throw the ball in the second half. Deontay Johnson will be our next guy. Deontay Johnson, borderline top 12 wide receiver this week. Going up against the Washington Commanders, this is a spot in which you should have the Carolina Panthers throwing the ball a ton in the second half. Right now, the spread in this game is about 7.5 points, and this game currently is sitting with the highest over-under, actually the second highest over-under of any game in the NFL. Should be the highest scoring or one of the highest scoring games of the week. Deontay Johnson's been very consistent over the past month. He is averaging, almost 11 targets per game. Must start option. And Jaden Reed, we will have to monitor the ankle injury, but if he is good to go, he will also be a must start name. Now, I do want to reiterate, I know a lot of people are very upset that we don't have Jaden Reed as a top 10 wide receiver in our rankings rest of season. Seems like maybe people have cooled down just a bit on that. But the reason why we never got there with Jaden Reed as a top 10 wide receiver is the target volume in this offense just simply isn't there. You have so many different wide receivers they can spread the ball out to. I mean, here, back-to-back weeks, Reed has only had 6 targets, and you've actually had only one game with over 6 targets all season. Now, the saving grace is this is one of the best offenses in the NFL. Jaden Reed has been one of the most efficient wide receivers in the NFL, and also Dontavian Wicks will probably miss this week. Now, dropping over to our next tier, we are going to have DK Metcalf good to go. DK Metcalf near the very top of the NFL in total targets. Going up against the Atlanta Falcons, I believe that this is actually the game that has the highest over-under, or right up there with what you had with the Panthers Commanders. But nonetheless, while DK Metcalf's been very disappointing in fantasy over the past few weeks, you have to look at the fact that you are a couple balls away from DK Metcalf just giving you the absolute nuclear performances. Not to mention against the Niners, DK Metcalf did have 11 targets last week. I mean, right now you're looking at 3 games with double-digit targets so far this season for DK. And against the Atlanta Falcons, it should be a very high-scoring game environment. Devonta Smith will be our next name. With Smith here, you are looking at only a 23.5 point implied team total. Actually, a little bit disappointed that the Eagles project to be this low scoring in comparison to what we saw with their projection last week. Now, obviously, they did not hit their projection last week. Obviously, they played a close game against the freaking Cleveland Browns, which is why I'm sure that we potentially have, I don't know, maybe the sports books putting out a worse projection on the Eagles than what we're typically used to seeing. Now, of course, with that being said, the Giants defense did look pretty good against the Cincinnati Bengals last week, but I'm starting Devonta Smith in the flock league relatively easily. Now, going over to our next pair of receivers, Garrett Wilson and Davante Adams will both be must-start options in week 7. Now, with that being said, I would prefer Wilson over Adams. And with that being said as well, I actually maybe have lowered expectations for this Jets offense this week. If you're looking at what sportsbooks are currently putting out, you have an implied team total of 19.5 points here for this Jets offense against a very good Steelers defense. This is supposed to be one of the lowest scoring game environments in the entire NFL. Now, yes, Davante Adams and Garrett Wilson both historically have been absolute target hogs, seeing anywhere from a 25 plus to 30 plus % of their offense's respective targets per game. Now, it's going to be very interesting to see how these wide receivers interact in New York. I don't want to rank either guy as a top 10 option in a tough matchup where it is very difficult to come by these projections, but obviously both players will need to be started, assuming that Adams is good to go. And while this is going to be a low scoring game, it's at least better than what you have, say, with like the New Orleans Saints Denver Broncos game. Literally the only thing to look forward to on Thursday night is going to be that if you are new over there on Underdog Fantasy, you'll get a free Bo Nix square, more than less than half a total yard if you use promo code FLOCK. If you use code FLOCK with that link in the description and comment section as well, you'll actually get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000 and a free team review in the live stream that we are doing every single night. Now, if you wanted to pair up that Bo Nix free pick with something, what I would be looking at with how many players are out in this New Orleans Saints offense is going to be for Spencer Rattler to have fewer than 182 passing yards. Now, moving over to our next option here, we're going to be looking at one of my top buy low candidates this week. Brian Thomas Jr., yes, is higher in my rankings this week than he was a week ago, even coming off the disappointing performance against the Chicago Bears. And the reason for this is it's a much better spot going up against the New England Patriots. You actually have sportsbooks this week giving the Jacksonville Jaguars an implied team total of 24 points. Now, what's very interesting, and I don't know what to expect here, is that New England obviously traveling to London, where the Jags have already had time to adjust and the New England Patriots possibly have not. If you take a step backwards and you look at Brian Thomas, besides this past week in a London game against a very tough Chicago Bears secondary, I mean, you had 4 weeks over double-digit fantasy points. Really, besides the London Bears game, I mean, the lowest game you had from Brian Thomas all year was 9.8 points. I still want to reiterate what we've been talking about for a while with Brian Thomas, is that Evan Ingram coming in will take away a decent amount of targets from the wide receivers at the very top. Obviously, Gabe Davis being fully healthy as well. We saw that happen last week. But Brian Thomas Jr. is still the alpha wide receiver in this offense in my mind. And sportsbooks are saying the Jags should have a pretty big bounce back. Now, Tyreek Hill will be our next receiver. Obviously, with Tyreek Hill, if you look at my rest of season rankings over on flockfantasy.com, you will see that he is significantly higher than this point. I mean, Tyreek is a wide receiver that the second that Tua is back in Miami will be the wide receiver one for me in fantasy. However, in this matchup going up against the Indianapolis Colts, where we have seen now 4 straight games from Tyreek Hill where he has yet to crack 15 fantasy points, I think it is a tough spot to be excited about anybody here in Miami. You do have an applied team total of 20.5 points, so it's not the worst thing in the world, but honestly, I think you may see Miami try to run the ball. T. Higgins will be our next name. With T. Higgins, he's been super consistent. Higgins has looked great so far. I mean, outside of the first week back from the hamstring, you had 12, 29, and 14.5 points. Obviously, Joe Burrow's passing volume was maybe limited a little bit against the New York Giants this past week. But right now, if you're looking at what you have against the Cleveland Browns, the Cincinnati Bengals have an implied team total of 24.5 points. All targets are being funneled through Chase and Higgins. Yoshi Vosh isn't having the same type of impact that you had at the beginning of the season. So stupid upside here with Higgins and a nice floor. Zay Flowers will be our next option. With Zay Flowers, I actually wouldn't mind throwing him in as a sell high candidate because I do want to reiterate what we've had so far this year. And keep in mind, people were saying we were too high on him 3 weeks ago. But in the games that the Baltimore Ravens have been able to lead from start to finish and have been able to run the ball over and over and over again, you had 4 targets and 2 targets for Zay Flowers. In the games that ended up being close, in the games that they had to go up against top teams, you had 10 targets, 11 targets, 12 targets, and 9 targets. So the game environment is going to be very different depending on the matchup that Zay Flowers will be playing in. This matchup in particular, going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, where the spread in this game's only about 3.5 points. And at the same time, you have an implied team total of 26 points for this Baltimore Ravens offense. I think this is one of those games where you could see a bunch of Lamar Jackson dropbacks, and Flowers definitely has the upside. And Amari Cooper has upside as well. Going up against the Tennessee Titans, my hesitation here is the spread on this game is freaking massive. I mean, right now, the Tennessee Titans project out to be one of the worst offenses, if not the worst offense in the NFL this week. The spread on this game's 8.5 points, and I think the Buffalo Bills should be able to run the ball in the second half. Obviously, with these guys getting traded, it wouldn't be a super big surprise if maybe they start off just a little slower and they ramp up as the season goes on. So I don't want to go all in here with Amari Cooper. I definitely think this week he is an interesting flex play. If you look at my rest of season rankings, we will have him higher than this. But in a matchup against the Tennessee Titans where you probably don't have to throw the ball with aggression, and at the same time, it's your first week on the team, I don't think you need to play him if you have a decent backup option. Now, going over to our next tier, these are going to be guys that I would rather bench if I can, but obviously, in a lot of leagues, you're going to have to play them. Like, personally, for me, if I had any of these receivers in the Flock League, which I have 2 guys, they would be in my lineup. But if you're playing in like a 10-team, 2 wide receiver, 1 flex, I hope you don't have to start them. Brandon Ayuk has been one of the most disappointing wide receivers in fantasy football all year now. It's been horrendous. If you took this guy in round 2 of an underdog draft or even in round 3 or 4 of your regular ESPN draft, you probably have been pulling your hair out. He's given you 1 game all year with double-digit fantasy points. Now, with that being said, it's still a good offense. You are currently looking at an implied team total of 24.5 points. It's a tough matchup going up against the Kansas City Chiefs, however so. Probably not wanting to start Ayuk. I definitely see the upside where you had 12 targets 2 weeks ago, but this matchup may not be one you want him in. Tank Dell will be our next guy. Obviously, Tank Dell sees a season high with his snap percentage, his targets, and his receptions last week, and a game environment where you have no Nico Collins. Going up against the Green Bay Packers, you probably have a decent amount of pass attempts here for Jordan Love, where they are having to play catch up in the second half. I think Dell definitely went from somebody that, had only 1 game with over double-digit fantasy points to now somebody that you can definitely consider in the flex every week. Darnell Mooney was the sell-high candidate for us after the 31-point bomb. Pretty easy to just come out and say, oh, yeah, guys, Mooney looks great, but Cousins won't have 500 passing yards every week. I think now people are maybe a little bit more reasonable with expectations for Darnell Mooney. But right now, if you look at sportsbooks, as we mentioned previously, this Seahawks-Falcons game projects out to potentially be the second or first highest scoring game of the week. And at the same time here with Darnell Mooney, this is a wide receiver that we have seen playing over 90% of the snaps in Atlanta every single week. I mean, if we take a step backwards, he is up averaging 6-7 targets per game. So you're going to have a low floor, but you are going to have a high ceiling as well. George Pickens, I'm actually a little more excited about. Now, I want to be on record saying that I don't exactly understand why Justin Fields is not the starting quarterback here in Pittsburgh. Now, of course, I'm an idiot. Of course, I have no idea what the hell I'm doing. But from my perspective, it seems like Justin Fields did everything he was asked to do and has earned the starting job. Now, with that being said, Russell Wilson coming in will be better for George Pickens. The reason for this is Fields himself is going to take a bunch of the rushing yards. Fields himself is going to take a bunch of rushing touchdowns. That will monopolize, cannibalize, whatever you want to call it, the fantasy points in this offense away from guys like Najee Harris, away from guys like George Pickens. So while I want to say that Justin Fields, at least from my perspective, may be a better option at this point for the Pittsburgh Steelers, I think Russell Wilson will be a better option for George Pickens. Xavier Worthy will be our next player. With Worthy, I actually like him more than this in terms of rest of season values. Now, the issue that you're going to have is obviously this rookie wide receiver where we have yet to see him turn into really the every down player. The season high we have seen with his snap rate was back against the Los Angeles Chargers with 73% of the snaps. But I mean, right before the bye against the Saints, he did see a career high 6 targets, which is very encouraging. Obviously, we have no Rashee Rice. And as we pointed out in the buy low video, you're actually in a spot in which you should expect that the rookie wide receiver continues to expand his role as the season goes on. And we actually had Rashee Rice coming out of the bye week last season, actually expanding his role in Kansas City. Now, Jordan Addison will be our next name. If you are looking at Jordan Addison, I think you should be very high on this Minnesota Vikings offense this week. Right now, sportsbooks against the Detroit Lions are projecting out the Minnesota Vikings to be a top 3 to 5 scoring offense. Now, of course, you may say, well, Mason, this Detroit Lions defense just shut down the Dallas Cowboys. Mason, sportsbooks have no idea what the hell they're talking. From my point of view, y'all know I believe this. I think sportsbooks have more information than all of us combined. I think that they know what they are putting out, and I don't think that you can beat Las Vegas sportsbooks over the long haul. Now, with that being said, maybe part of the reason here is obviously the injury to specifically Aiden Hutchinson is going to be a negative drawdown to this Detroit Lions defense. Sportsbooks are telling us that this should be a very good Vikings offense and should be a high-scoring game in general. Now, going over to Jameson Williams in the same game, Jameson is a boom-bust option that has been booming more than he's been busting as of late. I mean, obviously, he has looked very good. Now, with that being said, I will also point out that this is a brutal matchup. Typically, the implied team total that you have for the Detroit Lions is up at 27, 28 points. Whereas what you're looking at right now is actually sportsbooks projecting out us to see anywhere from 23.5 to 24 points for the final projection here, going up against what is believed to be, or maybe truly is, I don't know, but the best defense in the NFL. I mean, obviously Minnesota's been absolutely nuts. So with Jameson, the volume's not consistent. The past 3 games he's played, he's averaged 3 targets a game, and it's a tough matchup. I'd rather not play him. Like, to be honest, I think I could very easily see getting Jackson Smith-Njigba ahead of him. And you know what? I am going to make that update with the rankings on the site. I will go ahead and I will put JSN ahead of Jameson Williams. With JSN, actually, sportsbooks are projecting out the Seattle Seahawks to score more points than what you have with the Detroit Lions this week, as well as the fact that JSN has been sitting here averaging about 9 targets a game over the past 3. Now, of course, you still have Tyler Lockett. You still have DK Metcalf with solid roles here. So it's not the easiest spot in the world to come through and say that Jackson Smith-Njigba is going to absolutely dominate. But I think all these guys here are kind of boom or bust options, and we've seen some booms with the JSN volume. Now, Jalen Waddle will be the last guy in this tier. The positive is sportsbooks are giving more credit to this Miami Dolphins offense than what we are used to. You're up with an implied team total of 20.5 points. It's not like this is that tough of a matchup here going up against the Indianapolis Colts. Now, the bad news is, of course, I mean, over the past 4 weeks, Jalen Waddle is yet to eclipse double-digit fantasy points. I have Jalen Waddle and Ladd McConkey in the Flock League. maybe I could consider moving Ladd ahead of him. I mean, if you look at Ladd, this is a receiver that over the past 3 weeks has actually averaged 7 targets a game. You're going up against the Arizona Cardinals, which should be a pretty good matchup. This offense looks better coming out of the bye week with the healthier offensive line, with a healthier Justin Herbert. Obviously, we're going to have to monitor the availability of Ladd McConkey. It will be disappointing if he potentially is kind of like the game time decision where you don't have the clarity by the time you need it. Because I will say, what the hell are we doing here with a Monday night game that kicks off at 9 p.m. Eastern? Are y'all really trying to make sure that I never sleep? Our next guy will be Wan'Dale Robinson. Obviously, this ranking of Wan'Dale Robinson is under the assumption that you have Malik Neighbors playing. If Malik Neighbors will not be playing, then at that point, Wan'Dale Robinson flies up as he is currently second in the NFL in targets. Now, of course, with him being second in the NFL in targets, I do want to point out the fact that he has been pretty inefficient in general. I mean, you have 2 touchdowns off of like 70 targets so far this season. But if you're in a full PPR format, clearly he gives you the floor. Michael Wilson here at 35. We are making this initial set of rankings under the assumption that you are going to have no Marvin Harrison. Now, of course, with that being said, if Harrison does end up playing, then all of a sudden you're going to be dramatically moving down Michael Wilson, where he is no longer a viable play. But even without Harrison in this offense, I don't think that Wilson is an automatic lock starter, as this should be a very tough matchup going up against the Los Angeles Chargers. Now, Josh Downs, Michael Pittman will be our next 2 players. They have absolutely crushed as of late. If you're looking at Josh Downs, the man has averaged almost 20 points per game over the past 3 weeks. If you're looking at Michael Pittman has had double-digit fantasy points every week over the past 3. Now, what has happened over the past 3 weeks? We've had Joe Flacco under center for the Indianapolis Colts. What's really funny is if you looked at the underdog pick'ems, last week when you thought that Anthony Richardson was going to be the starting quarterback, underdog had Josh Downs higher, lower 34.5 receiving yards. As soon as Joe Flacco was announced the starter, that number went up to like 49.5. So the expectations should obviously be much higher with this overall passing offense, as well as these receivers with Joe Flacco under center. Whereas if you're looking at what you're going to get with Anthony Richardson in particular, A-Rich is going to be a quarterback that vultures a lot of the value in this offense, and that he's able to go through and he's able to take rushing touchdowns at the goal line and rushing yards himself. Now, Christian Kirk will be our next name. If you are looking at Christian Kirk, the volume came down dramatically with Evan Ingram coming back into this offense. You had 2 weeks with over 10 targets, but outside of that, you've had 4, 3, 4, 6. I would probably rather not play him if I could avoid it. Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs could slide up these rankings. Obviously, we have some injuries that we need to be monitoring in Green Bay, where we have the injury to Dontavian Wicks. We have the injury to Jaden Reed as well. Now, of course, I will be updating these rankings on flockfantasy.com literally every single day until kickoff. And on top of that as well, I will be putting out the flex rankings later this week. So you can either check in on the site or you can just check back in on the channel. Once we get additional injury news, we will update them. Gabe Davis at wide receiver 41. Gabe Davis coming off a monstrous week, right? 21 fantasy points. And if he didn't drop a couple balls, it could have been even bigger. Now, with that being said, he had 8 targets. It was a season high with his 8 targets. And if you're looking outside of that, there's not another game with double-digit fantasy points with Davis. Now, he did deal with some injuries in weeks 4 and 5, but still probably not excited to start Gabe Davis. To be honest with you, I am actually going to be moving Gabe Davis behind Jerry Jeudy as well as Jacoby Myers, even if Davis did just have the spike week. I feel like if you're playing Davis, you're just chasing the points. Jerry Jeudy and Jacoby Myers are both very similar to me, where these are wide receivers that should be alphas in their offenses, but at the same time, they're going to be guys where it doesn't particularly matter because their offenses are just going to be straight garbage. So you can start them if you need to. I'm more excited about them in a full PPR format because specifically in a non-PPR league, I think that the touchdown upside may be a little bit capped. Now, our next options will be DeAndre Hopkins and Calvin Ridley. If you're looking at Hopkins and Ridley, you have an implied team total of 16.5 points. This is supposed to be the worst offense in the NFL this week, according to Las Vegas sportsbooks. Ridley literally had like 8 targets last week, and it didn't matter. He had 0 fantasy points. To be honest with you, like Leggett, Cortland Sutton, I'm moving over Hopkins Ridley. Why the hell would I ever start DeAndre Hopkins, Calvin Ridley? I'm moving Lockett over him. I'm moving freaking Demario Douglas over him as well. Yeah, there's no reason in which you would ever go through and start the Titans guys over these other players. Really, the only reason we would rank him ahead of them is if we were just basing things off of name value. And obviously, name value doesn't score fantasy points. But I think that's all I have for you. Again, I really hope I was able to help you out in some way here. And of course, if you wanted to go tail me on that Spencer Rattler to have fewer than 188 passing yards, you can find that link to Underdog Fantasy in the description and the comment section. If you use promo code FLOCK, you will be getting a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, at the same time, you'll be getting an additional free Bo Nix pick, more than less than half a total yard for Thursday night's game, and a free team review in the live stream that we are doing every single night. Just make sure that you set up an account on flockfantasy.com with the same email address as your account on Underdog Fantasy. That way I'm able to credit you with the free team review voucher. But thank you again. I appreciate you and hope I get to see you out in the live stream later tonight.